All right, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our presentation, like wringing water from a stone. I'm trying to read our whole presentation name, Finding Common Ground in Transformative Agreement Negotiations. My name is Amy Pham. I'm the Senior Electronic and Open Content Librarian at the University of San Diego.
My name is Maria Savova. I'm Senior Director for Collections, Metadata, and Resource Sharing at the Claremont Colleges in Claremont, California.
And I'm Jamie Hutchins. I'm the Director of Open Research for Taylor & Francis in the Americas.
You should be familiar with the Charleston Code of Conduct by this point, so this is just a friendly reminder to conduct yourselves accordingly. When we put together this panel, me, Jamie, and Maria, we were inspired by a conversation that Jamie and I had about how it feels like everyone has done a transformative agreement already. And you've certainly heard about several established publishers and institutions and their successes around transformative agreements right here at Charleston over the last few years. But our question was, what about the rest of us? Those of us who are just getting started with transformative agreements. So what we wanted to do today was highlight the unique circumstances that each party brings to a transformative agreement, no matter how similar those parties may seem on the surface, and talk about the values and goals underlying our efforts. And we will also be having a frank discussion about what it takes to establish the groundwork for mutual understanding and partnership.
So part of what we were discussing really was about when you get into a partnership situation or a situation we want to form a partnership, quite often starting that with a negotiation isn't the easiest way to form a partnership. We're talking about the costs, some of the things we'll be talking about later in our discussion. Finding common ground starts, for us at least, with finding some common definitions. So you'll hear from my accent, I come from the UK. We quite often talk about transformational agreements, transitional agreements, transformative agreements, open access agreements. So we started with finding a common definition. This helped us to then think about how we would shape up the kind of data we need to share with each other, how we understand each other's motivations, which you'll see later on. And then we don't get fixed on the definition. It's a starting point, but ultimately what we're trying to form is a new partnership.
So the University of San Diego is a private liberal arts institution with high research activity. And the library where I work is unique in that it's one of eight academic units on campus with librarians having faculty status. So we have a vested interest in the scholarly communication process. We serve the other 7 academic units on campus and also provide resources for the law school, which is its own separate unit, primarily served by their own library. And like many libraries, inflationary increases are not part of our annual budget allocation.
Not to be in competition, but we're also quite unique by being a single library that serves 7 separate private, primarily teaching institutions with low to medium research activity with combined FTE of about 7,500 and the full discipline span. While the colleges are contiguously located, they are administratively and academically independent of each other, and the library is not part of any of the colleges. We're an outside service, and that will be important later on. They fund us collectively, and our budget does increase to cover inflation, but typically there is no room for expansion.
Again, hopefully you know who TNF is. There are different aspects to TNF. So one part of our conversation was, do you know all of TNF? And that's a big thing to get to know. We're often considered part of the Big Five by various definitions, certainly by the number of index journals, which is an important measure, a proxy measure for quality for us. We have a very distinct slant towards the humanities and social sciences for many historical reasons. But we have considerable portfolios in science, technology, and medicine. We also, perhaps not as easy to see, we publish on behalf of over 745 societies, 600 of which are in the humanities and social sciences. So we have a very different view than perhaps some of the other Big Five that you're used to dealing with. Importantly, when we were talking to Amy, one of the things that we discussed was that she had forgotten, in the moment we were talking, that we produce over 8,000 books a year as well. And that wasn't part of the TA framework we were discussing, but it's an important consideration for us in how we work with humanities and social sciences especially. And then sorry, just one more point, like the other imprints that you may know us through are Routledge, CRC Press, TNF, F1000, Piaget, and Dove Medical Press.
No, when you're talking about journals all day, sometimes it's easy to forget there are other methods of scholarly communication. So at USD, we currently have 7 active transformative agreements this year. We're adding a couple more next year, triple the number we started with just a couple of years ago in 2022. Our agreements are primarily cost neutral thanks to our consortially negotiated deals, which really helped us to transition from these pure read agreements to read and publish agreements. And to a certain extent, you could say that our APC costs are actually being subsidized by our paid subscription read costs. And that's what this graph is showing here. This small blue is our percentage of costs that are APC costs covered by our read costs.
We also have a growing number of transformative agreements, started with 1 in 21, and then we've added between 1 and 3 each year, currently at 7, and increasing by another 2 next year. The number of OE publications via the agreement also saw a huge jump each year. The 24 data is partial, and we still don't know if the upward trajectory will hold. Most of our agreements were negotiated by a consortium SCALC, and there's a wide variety of terms and types of journals covered, caps on OA articles, and the adoption of authors has been uneven. There's a lot going on in this table, so just some highlights regarding the performance of our agreements, the 6 that we had active last year. In terms of package costs, the inflation for all packages either remain at or close to previous levels of only read, or decrease in some cases to 0%. No agreement included additional costs for publishing. Only one of the agreements was multi-payer, which means that authors who had grant funding for publishing were asked to contribute a discounted APC, and authors who did not have funding were fully sponsored. One of our other agreements flipped to multi-payer this year. 2 of the agreements had no publications, OA publications at all, and they were both in the first year at the time. And the cost of sponsored APCs for the 4 agreements that had publications represented between 9 and 41% of the cost of the package. Seen another way, our read cost and cost per use decreased by 9 to 41%.
And from Taylor and Francis' perspective, our TAs grew from Europe, no surprise there. First was in 2016. We have over 450 agreements in place now, which cover over 1,100 institutions globally. The program in the US is a little bit more in development. So we signed our first agreement in 2019 with the Ohio State. That's now renewed twice, which we're pleased to say. We're going through cycles now where we're adding new customers and also renewing previous customers. So our TAs are changing as we move, and we're updating the terms and the methodologies we have for engaging with the library community as we move. The growth in the Americas is accelerating, and one of the reasons I look quite so tired here is because we've been talking to a number of new partners at this conference. But we expect now that there'll be over 25 agreements in the Americas, which range from small liberal arts schools up to school systems and also consortia. And just the last point here, really from Taylor and Francis' perspective, the lack of national mandates and significant government funding means that the drive for transformational agreements and any other open access agreement really comes from the library themselves. So we talk about the library being the open access champion. And part of the partnership we're trying to form now is how do we help that library express the value they're getting from these TAs so that their communities understand the benefits they're getting too. When we start talking more directly with USD and TCC, we have a different approach to how we look at their customer profile. From the surface, they look very similar. And as we started to dig into the data, the history behind their subscriptions, the way that they access content, and even their publication cycles is quite different from each other. And if we then compare them against the other groupings of institutions we work with, from an expenditure perspective, both are in our first quartile. From a publishing perspective, TCC is significantly larger than USD. So that's one of the big factors for us in getting the right balance in a TA. One of our key opening questions then really is how much publishing might we require as we move into this partnership? And then how do we actually predict the outcome and the uptake from authors? In terms of the overall performance, so this is something we just published this week. There's a QR code there if you're interested in, or reach out to me directly and I can send you this. What we wanted to look at was how do our customers speak about the performance of their transformational agreements themselves? So I can give you lots of bibliometrics, I can give you lots of performance information, but what are the values that you're really deriving outside of those within your institution? So my team put together a white paper this year. One of my team over in the back there, Juan, he's our customer success manager. He works directly with the institutions and provides them with data. So again, we can help them to support the business cases they need to make internally.
So Jamie mentioned a little bit earlier that the University of San Diego is in the first quartile for journal expenditures. And that's actually one of 3 factors that inspired us to pursue a transformative agreement with Taylor & Francis. So Taylor & Francis actually accounts for 50% of our individual journal title subscriptions. And it just seems like a good idea that in the process of converting our single titles into a package, that we could piggyback that conversation into a conversation about a read and publish deal. Just all the pieces are there for us. And because there are so many moving parts in a transformative agreement, I just wanted to start the conversation as early as possible, even if we don't come to an agreement in, even the next year. The second reason is that Taylor & Francis provides wider publication for social sciences and humanities subjects. So on the left here, you'll see is a list of disciplines at our university publishing under our current agreements. And you'll be unsurprised to see that STEM disciplines float to the top of that list. But when we started looking at our publication output with Taylor and Francis, our School of Leadership and Education Studies floated to the top, other social science disciplines floated to the top, and it was really interesting to see subject areas on campus that weren't being served by our current agreements publishing under Taylor and Francis, like the library and like our university administration. And finally, faculty on our campus are directly asking us about Taylor and Francis. So I track inquiries about open access publishing using Lib Insights, and in the past year, 20% of those inquiries are from faculty asking me, how can the library help support me publishing open in a Taylor and Francis journal?
I also have 3 areas of interest with some overlap with Amy. First, we are also very interested in increasing our offerings in humanities and social sciences. As you can see from the first chart, current agreements contain over 7,500 journals. Of those, only 20% are not STEM. But if you look at the OA publications by TCC authors across 22 and 23, respectively 77 and 58% of all open access articles were in the humanities and social sciences. At the same time, we subscribe to over 1,600 humanities and social sciences journals with Taylor and Francis, so potentially adding those to the pool would double our offerings in these disciplines. My second point is I would also like to offer OA publishing pathways to TCC authors who already publish with Taylor and Francis. In the last 5 years, we had 171 papers from TCC corresponding authors published there, and only 3 of those were OA. However, 82% of those papers were in humanities and social sciences subject areas. And my third interest is more general. I am looking to decrease my read costs in alignment with the move towards OA. As I already mentioned earlier, 4 of our big deals participating in transformative agreements have seen 9 to 41% of the costs decrease from read and transition towards publishing. And as we know from the research, about 50% of all articles published last year were open access, and I know that varies across publishers. But with or without transformative agreement, I would expect to see move towards decrease of our read cost. So how do we determine whether we could reach an agreement? We started looking at shared values with regards to TA. On the library side, we are both members of SCELC, and SCELC charged a task force to gather input and distill the membership's shared values and goals when it comes to TA, and I was part of that task force. So we came up with these values as a group with input from the membership, and if you look at them side by side with Taylor and Francis, you could see some overlap already. Both sides care about DEI and working in partnership. And keep watching for the non-highlighted stuff. We're going to address it. The SCELC task force also defined and ranked 9 goals, and the ranking reflects the membership as a whole. However, each institution also took these goals and rearranged them in accordance with our own library's particular goals and priorities. And these are USD's, ours, and Taylor and Francis's goals side by side. And then using my favorite low-tech tool of color coding, I can help you visualize the overlap we have in goals as well. So sustainability, author rights, publication quality, and research integrity, easy and straightforward administration for both authors and libraries. And I recognize that even with those overlapping goals, we all would still have to discuss the details, but a shared understanding of where we want to end up is already a great start for a partnership. But what about the stuff that's not highlighted there? We need to still talk about transparency, cost, and fairness, and how each of us perceives those and operationalize it in our own goals. So we put together some guiding questions to help us have a discussion.
Thank you, Maria. I really appreciated the visualization because I think it can be so easy to go into these kinds of discussions thinking, well, there is no way we're going to be able to come to an agreement, and it's just immediately combative. And I also want to say that this is what a negotiation looks like if you haven't been involved in one of these, or this is what it should look like. So we're really kind of just trying to pull back the mystique on these kinds of discussions. And that's what it is at the end of the day. So transparency was listed as a value for both my and Maria's institutions. And this isn't to say that transparency isn't a value of Taylor and Francis as well, just not as explicitly stated. And for me, transparency is really just about straightforward communication. Do we have all the information we need to manage an agreement on behalf of all of our stakeholders? And it's not really about trying to, pull the wool over a publisher's eyes or anything. I just want all the details because we have so many people involved in a transformative agreement stakeholder group. It's not just about our researchers. It's also about, who's going to be the end reader of that publication. It's about our staff and their time. It's about librarians, and it's about the rest of the stakeholders in the process as well.
I'd like transparent terms and predictability in both future cost and what to expect in the case of different scenarios depending on how things go. And I very much like transparency of how many articles of within the journals that are subscribed to are already open access, funded by authors or libraries from other institutions. And then non-disclosure clauses are not great, but frankly, that's a bit low on the priority list for me.
And whilst transparency wasn't our top level in terms of our values, they are expressed through a number of our values. So again, having the conversation allowed us to explore what we all meant by transparency, what was important to USD and to TCC. This comes through in a number of different ways. So from us, it's about partnership, being transparent in how we build the models together. Co-creation is really important so that we actually understand what data we're using, how we interpret that data, and then how we actually share that through the partnership. So one of the key things here is that we're no longer only in touch once a year. We're not just renewing a partnership every time there's a subscription that's updated. We're actually in touch with our partners every month. If there are problems to solve through technology, we have a solutions team. We have a pathway to make sure that you get the answers that you're looking for. In terms of the contracts that we put together, the licenses, they've morphed into something quite different than typical licenses. They talk about performance. They talk about reporting. There's no surprises in our licenses, so we're transparent from that perspective. And then the way that we actually work with authors, being transparent in the sense of adopting very liberal licensing policies back in 2017. We have a non-exclusive license to publish with the majority of our authors in over 2,600 journals. And we only have 50 journals that operate an exclusive license. And they're professional journals focused on the pharmaceutical industry. We offer a variety of CC BY licenses, and again, here we adopt a preference of our customer. So if they're driven by a mandate, which quite typically they are in Europe, or if they're driven by a preference or a faculty preference, that's something we configure within our back-end systems, but something that we also commit to within our licenses.
Jamie, you headed me off a little bit there by talking about, no, it's okay, by talking about authors' rights. And copyright. Do you want to expand a little bit more about that? Because Maria spoke clearly about how important license terms are to the library, and I think as well as just operational licensing terms, it's really important that we are also transparent about the rights that authors retain to their copyright, whether that's commercial or non-commercial.
I think this is like a key area. So the majority of authors that we work with don't really read what they sign, their license agreements. Quite often the library is being asked to reflect something that a faculty senate has voted upon and wants to pursue. So there's a lot to unfold here. But really, by being or adopting a non-exclusive license, what we're saying is, as a publisher, we have a particular license around the form of the output. We're not trying to claim any additional rights and maintaining the majority of the rights for the authors. The CC BY licenses are more to do with what can an end user do with your content once it has been published under an open access model. And that's not an agreement between the author and us. It's about the author saying what they're happy for the end user to do with their content. And again, the variety depends partly on the location. So there's a sort of geographical differences in approach, partly in disciplines. There are different ideas about what free or open access should be. And then with some of our bigger customers like the UC system, they actually have a faculty senate resolution that they wanted to adopt CC BY as their big preference. So again, for us, it's really about exploring the motivation. Quite often what we're doing now is a lot of education once we actually have the agreements in place, making sure that we flag to authors what they're signing and that they understand what their retained rights are.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, so we've talked about transparency, so can we be transparent about costs now? I would say this is the biggest question for all parties involved. How do we make the economics work for each of us sustainably? And, you know, I was telling Maria and Jamie earlier, I was showing them my notes. I've got like a whole page of cost. How are we going to fit this into the time frame of this presentation? So, you know, at the University of San Diego, we don't have any dedicated funding for open access. Even funding for adding new resources to our library collection is very ad hoc when it happens. And we are primarily and historically a teaching institution, despite the fact that we're also an R2. That's in pretty recent years, we were awarded that. So just, you know, aside from our institutional repository, it's very new for both the university and the library to be participating in the research publication process, much less, you know, actually helping to financially subsidize part of it. And that means that for us, ideally, a cost-neutral agreement is what we'd like to see out of this. You know, how do we transform what we already have? And how do we avoid paying for both read and publish costs at the same time, which is what Maria was talking about a few slides ago. And then one of the other factors that we have to consider, sometimes I'm asked, well, do you have any other departments on campus or champions on campus that will help you split the cost? And I will say that for our university, we have separate budgets for each academic unit, which really presents a barrier to sharing funding. Because, once you have someone in the position who has agreed to split funding with the library and they leave, whoever comes into that position is at liberty to say, well, why are you in our budget when this should be in your budget?
To me, sustainability means no increase to the cost beyond a reasonable small inflationary indexation. In fact, adding extra costs would be a deal breaker. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier that we're an outside service to our institutions. And so the same as Amy mentioned, to us, redirecting revenue from research offices is close to impossible, very, very difficult. So I'm looking at repurposing the existing read cost in alignment with the increase of OA content that is funded from authors or libraries from other institutions. And I am open to multi-payer models for what that would do in humanities and social sciences. Speaking of trade-offs, while nobody loves caps, I am also open to that discussion if that would help contain the cost.
And no surprise, really, this is one of the areas we had the biggest discussion, and we continue to have a discussion about. Sustainability for us is a bit different. It's about covering operational costs for us and for the partners that we publish on behalf. It's often about actually issuing a return to those owners that they were anticipating moving into what was a subscription-based deal and now moving into transformative deals. So they're getting revenues from different sources, and it's being reallocated across different constituents in our portfolios. From the publishing perspective as well, our ability to continually improve and invest in new technology. You would have heard multiple discussions this week about research integrity, which is a major investment area for us. As a company as well, Taylor & Francis is owned by Informa Group. So we contribute to Informa Group. They supply us with common services, so not dissimilar to your own library. So the margin that we create there is also something that goes to pay for those services. The global infrastructure that we create is really important to the communities that we work with as well. So there's a slightly different view on what sustainable is. We don't take one single approach for that reason. So we know that a comprehensive TA might be beyond some of our potential customers. So we start with that definition, and then we dig into the numbers, and we look to find other kinds of ways to make this approach work. We've developed subject-level transformational agreements where we worked with one institution to support education only. That was actually a presidential initiative. We recently have put together a discipline-based, so humanities and social science only transformational agreement. And then we have something that's much more comprehensive where we're trying to transform the entire relationship. And then just on top of that, though, we know this is not going to work for every institution. So we're also experimenting with other models, non-APC based models. So we work with, we own PJ and their annual institutional membership approach. You may have seen us just dipping our toe into Subscribe to Open with a pilot with 3 journals this year. And then just this week, we announced a new attempt to try this a bit differently in the Nordic nations, which we're calling Collective Pathway to Open Publishing, which is using multiple streams of revenue to essentially make those journals open access.
I really appreciated Taylor and Francis's flexibility in our conversations. When we've talked about ways that we can make the finances work for our university, Maria mentioned multi-payer models earlier. I'll say I have been avoiding that conversation. For us, multi-payer models really create concerns around agreement uptake. Faculty find them very confusing to have to go through that workflow. And the number one question I get if we have a multi-payer model is, well, what if I have a grant, but I wasn't expecting to pay an APC? Do I have to use my grant money for that? And what if I got a grant years ago? Are they going to find out that I have a grant and then not cover my APC? And just being able to avoid that kind of confusion and making it as easy as possible is really our end goal at the end of the day. Jamie also mentioned just doing like a discipline-specific pilot, and that's something that we're also talking about. You saw in one of my slides that our School of Leadership and Education Studies tops the list of publications with Taylor and Francis, and we have a really strong relationship with them, and I think it's a great place for us to start if we can't afford a site-wide license. And the really cool thing about our School of Leadership and Education Studies is that they actually include open access publication as part of their reappointment, promotion, and tenure process. So I think that's a great place to start championing for open access at a university. And we talked about a couple of other things as well, like, maybe we could see a reasonable increase in read costs to help subsidize publish, or consider relinquishing perpetual rights for certain journals that would help bring down the cost.
I just want to add, I don't disagree on the multipayer. I know these are confusing to our authors. We already see this causing problem with an agreement that used to be fully funded and now is multipayer. I'm simply looking for ways to make this work. So this is one of the trade-offs that's not ideal. But if it takes extra funding to make the agreement work, that's one of the things we're looking at. And possibly better workflows from the publishers could help with that. But yeah, they are confusing.
And you would have seen from our earlier slide as well, friction-free publishing. So something that's easy for authors to navigate. And this is one of the reasons for us that the multi-payer model, even though we can support it, we tend to move away from it if we can. Again, very slanted towards humanities and social sciences, we know that less than 10% of our authors have any kind of funding from a federal source. So it's something we can support, and again, we can do, for Maria, we can experiment with that, we can gain data.
It up.
Yeah, it's all right. So this is something we have talked about. We actually did a very large piece of work with the UC system as well, and we actually moved away from multipayer for them. So again, this is an experiment that they're working with us on.
All right, and then we're going to wrap up by talking about fairness. I think our final slide here, so that you all can ask us questions. So when we were looking at the goals and values and where we overlap, if you were fast about it, you might have caught that the University of San Diego did not list fairness. I'm the monster that left that off of our list because, I find fairness a difficult concept to grasp in this kind of situation. I think it's great in principle. I want us to be fair to all of our stakeholders and our partners in this process. But, I want to ask the table here, how do you define fairness? And do you think it's possible in this kind of situation for a library which is a nonprofit organization, to be fair to a for-profit business? And Maria, I'm going to pass it to you. I think you had some really interesting comments when we talked about this and what fair economics mean.
Thank you. So part of the reason maybe I view this slightly differently is that I actually started my career in business and then I transitioned to nonprofit. And I'm very interested in fairness. At the same time, I understand open access is not free. It's a business model. And as a commercial entity, the publisher needs to make profit. This is the reason why they are in business. At the same time, I expect fairness built in the various scenarios that we're looking at. For example, if the proportion of open access articles in my subscriptions that are funded from somewhere else keeps growing, I expect that to be reflected in a decrease in my read cost. That's fair. If a multi-payer agreement brings a revenue more than projected, I expect that overage to be distributed back to participants fairly, and not just serve to increase the publisher profit. And I understand and I support publishers making profit. This is what they do. We need them to keep publishing because as libraries, we can't function without this is true partnership, whether it's a transformative agreement or not. We need the content to be produced in order to serve our users.
And again, from our area, fairness is not something we state, but it's something we want to enact through our agreements. I've worked for both non-profit and for-profit entities. Our cost base is essentially the same. Non-profits tend to talk about surplus, and quite often the surplus then goes to a mission-driven body and doesn't get reinvested in the publishing program. So quite often we found that we weren't sustainable from that perspective. As a for-profit, we reinvest in the infrastructure. But when we think about fairness, we really think about this from a global perspective. So if we're doing transformation on a global scale, making sure that we're fair when we're working with sub-Saharan African institutions, those that we're working with in Latin America and those that we work in North America. We know everybody suffers from budget issues. So we're trying to introduce that fairness in terms of being consistent in the way that we approach this and offering as much as we can into those territories in terms of support. Some of the ways that we do that through the profits that we have, we recycle those as waiver programs. We offer the concessions within those territories as well. And we also have, in many years, actually supported access or zero increase in access through the recent pandemic, for instance. So different approaches to fairness, different perspectives, and having a global versus a local viewpoint, I think, has challenged us all, I think, in defining what fairness is.
All right, I think on that note, we have just a few minutes left for questions. Sorry, we must have, someone's ready. We have a couple of runners in the audience from Taylor and Francis who will pass mics around. And I believe they're getting mics from, oh, wow, okay. We might allow a little bit of extra time after this. Okay, first you, and then I saw there was someone over there next, and then Jason Price will be third.
Hi, Frank Frontiers. I'm really pleased to hear for the first time in years someone discussing multi-pair here. It was really helpful from all three of you to hear something about it, but I have two questions. The one, why are you attributing this to social science humanities so specifically? And secondly, especially California, or both of you are California, but you see system, right? Do you know?
Private.
You are not UC system,
Okay.
but
we get that overlap a lot.
yeah. Okay. Anyways, I'm interested whether you know anything about other institutions' opinions about that, or overall uptake in the US or even globally. Is there anything known? Because this is around for like 5 years now, right? Sorry.
First, to answer your second question, we're focusing on humanities and social sciences because that's the particular motivation for us to be talking to Taylor and Francis. Obviously, we have already agreements that cover STEM, and there it's more straightforward for the multi-payer because there is a lot of grant funding in STEM. When we talk about humanities and social sciences, first, our current agreements don't provide enough journals, but also that grant funding is a problem there. So while I opened it up as a possible avenue for gathering the necessary funding to make this work, I recognize that might be a non-starter.
I think you asked about other institutions and their approach. So some of our partners don't want their researchers to use their funding for anything else. So they would prefer to use the library funds. They're in a luxury position. They have a budget that can cover it. Other institutions like the UC system, we had a long negotiation with them. We could have built a workflow that would have actually supported that. But when we actually got to the point where we realized the impact it would actually have, it was very small amongst their community. And partly this is to do with our portfolio and where we're focused. The science, technology, and engineering medical groups, there is a different pattern. There's a very different pattern in Europe as well, where there are mandates particularly in place. And we have individual workflows that we can imply for specific requirements. So we're trying to be as open to the idea as possible, but everybody's interpreting it very differently.